Hello. So you've probably been asked this question before. If you could invite a bunch of celebrities to attend a dinner party at your house, who would you pick? It's a great conversation starter, but I've got two big problems with this question. The first one is that I can't help but constantly worry about how awkward that dinner party would actually be. Like, what could I say that would be even vaguely interesting to a table full of celebrities? My best story is about the anonymous person who shit themselves in the hallway at my school, who we all called the Phantom Shitter. But my main problem with this question is that I would happily forfeit any person on that guest list if it meant I could have one person, Anthony Bourdain. Now, if you don't know who that is, the quickest way to describe him would probably be as a celebrity chef. But to me, that's kind of like calling the Beatles a boy band. So if you'd please indulge me, I'd like to give a brief history of who Anthony Bourdain is. For a majority of his adult life, Anthony Bourdain was indeed a chef, but in the span of about 18 years, he wouldn't just become a celebrity, but an American national treasure and cultural icon recognised around the world. That trajectory was kickstarted in 1997 when Bourdain, who was still working as a chef at the time, decided to write a personal exposé on his experiences working in kitchens across New York City. Anthony had been an aspiring writer for a while and had even published 2 crime novels, but neither of them were exactly hits, so I think he decided to write about what he knew. It was called Don't Eat Before Reading This, and it was Anthony's attempt to try and show people what really goes on behind the doors of restaurant kitchens, shamelessly revealing all the dirty secrets that chefs don't want you to know. And after multiple failed attempts to get it published in a free weekly called the New York Press, Anthony decided in a last-ditch effort to send it to the New Yorker before outright discarding it. But in a series of extremely lucky events, his mother Gladys had been a copy editor at the New York Times, so not only did the editor read it, he loved it and decided to print it as a guest column. At the same time, one of Bourdain's close friends had shown his writing to his wife. She was so impressed that she decided to offer him the chance to write a full memoir based on his experiences, the result of which became Kitchen Confidential, a book that quickly went on to become an international bestseller and change Bourdain's life forever. But of course, it's not all luck, because beyond just offering some shocking industry secrets, Bourdain had articulated one of the most meaningful explanations of what it means to be a chef. That to do the job, you don't just need to have a love for food and passion for the craft, you need to be like Frank from Hellraiser level of masochistic. It's insanely stressful, the hours are long and unsocial, you are in an almost constant state of mental and physical discomfort. Basically, it's very different from your average workplace.
Why aren't you wiping the plates? Why aren't you wiping the plates?
But he shows you exactly why those who choose that life endure all that, and it's because what spawns from all that suffering is a rich culture and community with its own language and customs. There is a mutual respect and camaraderie amongst those who work in kitchens.
Casually referring to an employee to their face as a genitally challenged, lower than whale shit bivalve whose parents probably commingled with livestock.
That it offers more than just sex, drugs and rock and roll, but it gives purpose and meaning to those who often drift into the industry with very little. Now, I do think it's important to note that Anthony wasn't technically the first to do this, and I think a big reason behind Kitchen Confidential's success is that it was able to come out in a post-Marco Pierre White world, where his book, White Heat, released a decade prior, had helped create the idea of the rock star chef that we now take for granted. However, there is a reason that most people now credit Bourdain as the quintessential version of that, and I think it's because there is something that he could do much better than Marco, and that was television. Because what Marco lacked in charisma, and no offense to him, but any discernible humanity,
he gave me some money, which was enough to take me to Harrogate on the bus.
Anthony came with in spades, and he wasn't just likeable, he also seemed to be the real deal. You know, for many chefs, what Anthony said was the truth, and in an out-of-character moment, that attracted American television. Initially, it was just a few local news appearances, but as the book continued to grow in popularity, before you knew it, our boy was talking to Oprah. Now, whilst at this point Anthony was far from having any sort of on-screen persona, I think there was already something that audiences were attracted to about him. And this is arguably what led the Food Network to letting Anthony have his very own food travel show. Now, it's important to remember that this is the early 2000s, and food television was a very different place. Nowadays, we can't move for trendy food shows. There are what seems like an unlimited supply of Netflix ones, all shot like they're nature documentaries. There are as many celebrities with travel programs now as there are with Scientology memberships. Back then, food television was far from the mainstream appeal or reputation that it has now, and food shows usually fell into one of two categories. They were either largely focused on the food or on the personality. Now, this is not to say there weren't iconic chef personalities on TV, but the format of their shows were usually instructional. Cooking programs weren't really must-watch TV. And of the few food travel shows that there were, the hosts were usually old British men who were of a certain time.
Anyway, she's one of those ladies who's a bit of a tart, a bit precise, so I'm letting them get on with it while I'm just sitting here having a slight glass of wine.
And I think what the Food Network saw in Anthony Bourdain was the potential to bridge that gap. The show was to be an adaptation of Bourdain's next book called A Cook's Tour, and the idea was simple. Watch a hardened New York chef travel to exotic locations and eat the most outlandish things. And watching it today, it is a pretty generic travel show, but you can also already pinpoint exactly why Anthony was special. And it's not just his cool persona or his now iconic narration.
This woman is a force of nature. She's a mix of Yenta, Jewish mother, and six-cylinder Gambino family hoodlum.
Is that beneath all of that there is a genuine respect for the place and people that he's visiting. You know, a lot of other travel shows, whilst good for what they are, often emphasise how foreign or weird another culture is because the source of their entertainment is showing an audience something they've never seen before, something that is so different from their day-to-day lives. And I think that is more or less the kind of show that A Cook's Tour was set up to be. Anthony just refused to do that. From the very first episode, Anthony is eating and experiencing things that are very different to both his and his audience's lives, but all with the unwavering dedication to treat it as normal as the people of that culture do.
Kind of a cross between like French fries and beef jerky.
The point is that Anthony had done something small but profound with A Cook's Tour, and something that he thought would be a brief 15 minutes of fame revealed itself to be something he was genuinely gifted at. And as the Food Network tried to restrain the show to more Western-friendly locations, Anthony and his team sought greater creative control and found it in the Travel Channel, and thus a new show was born. And this is the show that really launched Anthony's career, because the show became much less about the food or location that was featured in an episode, and much more about what audiences really wanted, which was Anthony himself. Anthony was no longer just the host, he was the major creative force driving the show, and it is clear that he relished in constantly pushing the boundaries of what a food travel show could be. There are whole episodes in black and white as homages to Italian cinema. There are extended sequences where he loses his mind on absinthe in Paris. At times, No Reservations is almost like a direct parody of the food travel show format with an overpaid, self-absorbed host.
Look, honey, it's that guy.
Isn't that idiot who eats on the Travel Channel?
And in 2006, that all came to a head in an episode that, in the career history of Anthony Bourdain, is regarded as a major turning point. Anthony and his team were filming an episode of No Reservations in Beirut when Israeli forces began bombing the city. And as Bourdain and his crew watched the chaos and waited to be evacuated, they were faced with a decision on whether they could still make an episode, and if so, what that would be. But Anthony felt that there was something that needed to be said that wasn't being communicated in the mainstream media's coverage, and it started to dawn on him that maybe they could be the ones to do that. The episode they made went on to be nominated for an Emmy, and it not only remains a vital record of the people of Beirut's lives being changed forever, but also Bourdain himself. Suddenly, No Reservations began to touch on issues that previously would have seemed far out of reach for a show of its kind. Like in Laos, where Anthony interviews a man who was the victim of an unexploded bomb during the CIA's covert bombing of the country during Vietnam. And it's really hard to overstate how groundbreaking this was. Like, for example, you could turn on the Travel Channel at the same day this was airing and see this.
Take a journey to Donut Paradise.
We don't just have a big blob in the middle. We have jelly going through the whole donut, so that every time you bite the donut, you get some jelly.
And with that, the time came for the show to evolve again, culminating in what many would argue is Bourdain's greatest work, Parts Unknown. And that isn't just a result of how much more assured Bourdain is as a host, or how each episode is more like an experimental short film than an installment of a travel show, but I think because the show was now driven by a very specific philosophy. I think the ultimate aim of an episode of Parts Unknown isn't just to entertain or educate, but to fundamentally change people's perceptions about the world. So for example, the Tokyo episode of Parts Unknown is a fleshed out exploration of that city's sexual culture. Anthony has a earnest and curious conversation with a pioneer of tentacle porn art. However, it is all with this specific purpose of forcing an audience to reflect on how we usually like to laugh at these parts of Japanese culture because they seem abrasive and strange to us, but how that is really indicative of how uncomfortable we are with sex as an industry and the kinkier sides of ourselves.
Sure, a lot of what you've seen looks different from maybe the mainstream, but roughly 50% of all movies rented in American hotel rooms are adult films.
I think it's also become like the predominant cliche of all Bourdain-esque shows now that food can be this unifier and that breaking bread with someone can cross political and social boundaries. And whilst I think that's definitely true at some level, I also think it's kind of in danger of becoming the kind of thing that like just white people say. But in Parts Unknown, Anthony actually does the hard work of testing that theory. The episode in West Virginia being one of the best examples where pretty much everyone featured in that episode are not only of political leanings, very opposed to both Bourdain and much of his audience, but who also seem to fit our stereotype of the kind of people that come from that place. And throughout the course of the episode, Anthony works not only to unpack that stereotype, but by focusing less on what they disagree on, he forces us to listen to them and actually understand why.
It's so easy from afar to say that Cole's time here has come and gone, that we should let the miners move, find some other work. What other work? The state's biggest employer is now Walmart.
With Parts Unknown, the focus of the show had actually moved away from Tony and became much more dedicated to giving a voice to people who so often don't have one in mainstream Western media. And it was with Parts Unknown that Bourdain reached new heights of success and renown, winning countless awards, having enough clout to interview Barack Obama in a tiny restaurant in Vietnam. He published cookbooks, graphic novels, he cameoed in movies. There were even plans to open a Singapore-style market in New York called Bourdain Market. It seemed like Anthony could literally do anything. In the space of 18 years, he had gone from a chef with a writing dream to like an avatar for the human experience, exploring the world on our behalf, asking its most profound questions in search of truth. But suddenly, the news broke that whilst on a shoot for Parts Unknown in France, Anthony Bourdain died by suicide. Now, whilst I'm obviously biased, I do think that Bourdain's death was one of the most shocking and affecting celebrity deaths in recent memory. I think the reason it was so devastating is that people felt a connection with Anthony that was deeper than their relationship with other celebrities. Bourdain wasn't just someone you watched on TV, he felt like a genuinely important person in your life who had, in small but profound ways, changed you and helped you make sense of the world. And that connection wasn't just gone all of a sudden, I think it was fundamentally questioned. We knew that he had meant so much to us, but after what happened, many of us didn't know exactly what that was anymore.
What do you think the meaning is?
One of the unfortunate things about somebody who obviously has some kind of tragic part to them is, does that undermine or somehow diminish the message they were trying to get out there? I don't have an answer. I hope not.
And I think we were all in desperate need for something to help us articulate that, to help us find some sense of meaning in it all. Ironically, it kind of felt like we needed Anthony Bourdain to figure out Anthony Bourdain. But only a year after his death, a film was announced by documentarian Morgan Neville that aimed to do just that, called Roadrunner. It seemed like it was asking the same questions that we had, not just about his death, but meaningful ones about his life. What does Anthony Bourdain mean now? What kind of legacy does he leave behind? Above all, it sought to get to the truth of Bourdain, and hopefully in doing that, maybe offer us some semblance of closure.
I want people to be able to make some sense out of his death. I hope the film in some way gets people to start to think of him as a whole person again.
And at the time I thought, great, here comes this moment of catharsis that we've all been so desperate for, and Neville seems like he's got the exact right attitude, not trying to find any easy answers, but to take a sensitive, nuanced approach to a complex issue. And oh fuck. Right before the film was released in the US, it leaked that Neville had hired an AI software company to recreate Anthony's voice reading out letters he'd written to be used in the film. And as soon as that news broke, people piled on the decision as ghoulish and disgusting, and it sparked its own ethical debate about celebrities and technology that is a kettle of fish beyond this video. Many also criticised Neville's decision not to interview Asia Argento, in light of the film's treatment of her relationship with Bourdain and how it implicitly paints her as the cause of Bourdain's suicide. However, this is not to say the film was a failure, and if anything, it was largely praised by those who argued that looking past those two key missteps, was a worthy tribute to Anthony Bourdain. That not only was it a cathartic record of those closest to Bourdain trying to process their grief, but that it finally gave us a look at the real Bourdain. That through raw outtakes and never-before-seen footage, the film revealed a much more human and flawed person than the often iconized one that we'd built up in our heads. And that instead of trying to find any clear answers around his death, simply offered an honest and nuanced portrait of the real person. However, some have argued that in a film like Roadrunner, there are manipulations of reality going on that run much deeper than just the inclusion of fake voices or the omittance of real ones. Rather, they lie in the very motivations and nature of the film itself. Maria Bastillos, in her review of Roadrunner, argued that our search to find the real Bourdain in a commercialized piece of media like this is inherently misguided. That even if the film tries to outright avoid further mythologizing Bourdain, it can't help but do that at some level due to its very nature. It is a film telling a story of Bourdain, and by creating a narrative out of someone's life, you inherently romanticize reality to some degree. Neville in interviews has talked a bit about this, how they crafted the story of Bourdain's life for the film.
The story we're telling is somebody who in middle age, who has been working as a chef for 25 years, is suddenly given world fame, fortune, and the chance to travel the globe. It's everything he always wanted.
Pretty amazing.
The question is, what happens when you get everything you always wanted?
How much truth do you lose when you do that? By structuring the facts of someone's life into something that an audience can relate to and take meaning from. It implies that perhaps what we think is a complex, authentic look at Bourdain is more a character in a story than a real person. Corey Stillman added in his review that this line between effective storytelling and perversion of the truth is something that Bourdain wrestled with in his shows.
We are changing the world by looking at it through cameras, as happens every time you look at real people, the real world, real places. Where does that fall in your comfort zone?
But he didn't just struggle with it in his work, he also felt the effect of it personally. Bourdain's public image had grown into this cult, almost godlike status, and it's clear that that weighed on him, the difference of the public's idea of him and who he really was. And in making a film like Roadrunner, are we in danger of simply moving from one romantic idea of him to another? From a guy who had the best job in the world to someone who got everything they wanted but struggled to be happy despite all of that. As Bastillos writes, the film about the dangers of the fishbowl cannot be made within the fishbowl. Now, at this point, you could definitely argue, are you not massively overthinking this? There are thousands of biopics of people's lives. We all accept they are stories rather than 100% truth. Well, I think the difference here is that this is a story that is propelled and defined by a suicide, and if that story is inauthentic or mishandled in any way, how does that affect how we view that? And something that both Stillman and Bastillos argue is that our search to find the real Bourdain is perhaps emblematic of a deeper ethical grey area that we refuse to acknowledge until now. That even though we felt like we really knew Bourdain, we didn't, and maybe our entitlement in feeling that we deserve that even now is just proof that we refuse to accept that. In believing that we can gain such an understanding of someone who we've never met, are we refusing really to treat him as human? One whose such personal and intimate things can't be understood through the myopic lens of a film. Basically, all of this made me realise that maybe tributing Bourdain is a lot more complicated than I thought. Now, this video is not a discussion or review of the film Roadrunner. For one thing, the film didn't come out here until last December. Instead, I want to explore the very messy situation I think we find ourselves in with Anthony Bourdain. That we are seemingly stuck between a desperate need to tribute a man who meant so much to us, to find this deeper understanding and meaning from his life, with a nagging notion that in doing that, are we betraying who he really was and everything he stood for? I started writing this video with all that in mind, that trying to tribute Bourdain this way is an insult to his memory at worst, and a waste of time at best. I think one thing you can say about Anthony Bourdain for sure is that he changed a lot in 18 years. But at the same time, one of the core reasons behind his success is something he seemed to always have had. It's that he just seemed like the most interesting man in the world. So much so, he has literally been called the most interesting man in the world. Now, whilst I admit this is probably going to be a huge case of dissecting the frog, I think if we want to start to better understand not just Bourdain, but our relationship with him, we have to ask why. Why was he someone we didn't just consider to be cool, but someone we felt so genuinely connected to? What really was the allure of Anthony Bourdain? Well, to start, what often makes someone interesting is their contradictions, and Anthony was no different in that regard. Like, on the one hand, he very much fit the traditional mold of male coolness, like he was into jiu-jitsu and punk music and he rode the big quad bikes. But the more you watched of him, the more eclectic his passions turned out to be. He was a huge history buff. He devoured classic French literature and cinema. It was like he was somehow interested in everything.
This is just right up my alley.
Yeah, okay.
He also had this ability to be both deeply opinionated while seeming devoutly unpretentious. Like, he would be very prescriptive about certain things you should eat or do when traveling. But at the same time, he was almost always open to other people's approaches to life. He was not above treating the Waffle House with the same earnest curiosity as he did a Michelin star restaurant. Physically, he was like a paradox of old and young. I mean, the man was 60 years old, ate food and drank beer for a living, and still looked like that. The guy was Beyonce for dads. But also spiritually, you could characterize him as like the ultimate Renaissance man, someone who'd peaked in their chosen profession and had now earned the luxury of living as a man of leisure. But he was also someone who's keenly aware of injustice and fought tirelessly to uncover it through his work, in the last years of his life becoming one of the primary male voices of the Me Too movement. Now, from that description, you could definitely agree that Anthony Bourdain sounds like a very interesting and cool person. But to me, I think the real allure of Anthony Bourdain goes beyond just who he was himself as a person. It was what he represented that made him so compelling. Those who know the story of Bourdain know he's like the living embodiment of getting a second chance in life. He was someone who lost huge swathes of his youth to addiction, but successfully recovered, continued to work hard at his passions, and realised his life's dream in his mid-40s. Of course, for some, Anthony also represented what was considered a dream life, travelling the world, eating delicious food and having conversations with fascinating people. Kind of sounds like the life that everyone would want. But I would strongly disagree with that and argue that Anthony almost represented kind of the opposite. Now, of course, a lot of Bourdain's work was at heart about the importance of travel. He talked about it a lot. But he never preached the idea that you see a lot of like lifestyle gurus and influencers do, that having a life full of exotic adventures and traveling is the key to happiness and wisdom. I think Anthony was smart enough to realize that his lifestyle was a hugely unrealistic privilege funded by TV networks, and inferring the idea that you're now automatically a more empathetic person because you've been on a holiday makes you sound like a fucking idiot. It's not about the life Anthony seemed to have, it was about how he lived it. Bourdain, to me, embodied this attitude to life that was dedicated to squeezing any and every tangible experience out of it whilst you still can. By being interested in everything like he seemingly was, pushing yourself out of your comfort zone like he always did. And like he said, if you don't risk the bad meal, you'll never get the magical one. Anthony didn't represent a lifestyle that was supposed to be lusted after, but a simple philosophy that anyone could implement in their day-to-day lives. And that humble philosophy relates to what I think Anthony ultimately represented to us, which was total authenticity. It's arguably the unifying mission statement of all of his work, is that he was chasing the truth of the places and people he visited. However, the most consistent source of authenticity on the show was Anthony himself. It's true, Bourdain changed a lot in 18 years, but it's also true that in the thousands of hours that are recorded of him, he seems to stay almost exactly the same guy. As the show gained more and more popularity, you would expect that he'd adopt more of a persona, but in reality, the opposite ended up happening. Instead, that tough guy image that he got famous on started to peel away and reveal a more sensitive human being. Parts Unknown feature episodes that have Anthony at his most vulnerable, opening up about the darker parts of his life as well as the things he still continued to wrestle with. And this is really my best explanation as to why we felt the way we did about Anthony Bourdain. It's that everything that seemed so great about him, everything he seemed to represent, was predicated on this idea that it was all real. It's like he'd somehow done the impossible, to seem like the most interesting, cool guy on the planet, and also to truly be himself at the same time. Two things I think most of us would usually consider to be mutually exclusive. But the fact is that this idea of total authenticity was fundamentally questioned by his death. Now, whilst this goes without saying, Bourdain's death was of course a complete shock and devastating to those who really did know him. But for those of us who didn't, I think it forced us to re-examine everything we thought we knew about him and our relationship with Bourdain. And specifically this idea that many of us used to think that who Bourdain was on camera was who he really was, and he chose to give his real self to us through his art. But his death was a sudden and shocking confirmation that there was a lot about Bourdain that maybe we didn't know anything about. And if this was true, if our whole idea of him was false, then who was the real Anthony Bourdain? The immediate aftermath of Bourdain's death was a very emotionally complicated and messy time. And people processed that in a variety of ways, some healthy, some very much not so. Within days of his death, stories were published hyper-analysing the circumstances leading up to it, like how much money he had in the bank, the last meal he ate. But eventually, all media focus started to go on one person, Asia Argento. In the last years of his life, Bourdain had begun dating Argento after they met shooting an episode of Parts Unknown. Then, shortly before Anthony's death, photos were published implying that Argento was having an affair. And in one of Anthony's last Instagram stories, he plays music from a movie called Violent City, which includes a scene of photos being taken of a man with his mistress. Now, all of this was, of course, tabloid crack, because it fit a very old and sexist narrative of the woman who starts dating the tortured artist and eventually leads to his ruin. But for me and many others at the time, I didn't particularly agree with this narrative around Bourdain's death. And that wasn't motivated purely out of kindness by choosing not to blame a person's suicide on someone. It's that I think we all refused to accept such a blunt explanation for his death. It didn't seem right, or for lack of a better word, satisfying. Because Anthony's work is littered with hints at what seemed like very deep-rooted personal struggles, from his frank discussions of addiction in Kitchen Confidential to literally going to therapy for the first time on television. I think those of us who were longtime followers of Bourdain thought that whatever happened with Argento could only be at best the straw that broke the camel's back. So when the media tried to put all that blame on her, I think we were all like, great, but could we not talk about all that other shit on the camel? And Bourdain left behind a wealth of work beyond just his TV shows. There were several books, interviews, and countless personal essays. And I think there was a compulsion amongst many of us in the wake of his death to look back on all that with new eyes. That maybe amongst it all were signs we'd ignored, insights into him we hadn't understood at the time but perhaps could now, and maybe even answers to our questions. This is exactly what made a project like Roadrunner inevitable. Neville and his team gained unprecedented access to almost everything recorded about Bourdain, watching over 10,000 hours of footage of him. And whilst I wholeheartedly agree that it is extremely ethically dubious to try and theorise about the real-life personal struggles of someone purely by hyper-analysing the art they create, I also think that we have to accept that it is borderline impossible to watch anything with Anthony Bourdain in it now and not be somewhere in the back of your head reassessing it in light of what happened to him.
That's the greatest thing ever. You know, I'm feeling kind of sentimental, I'm feeling kind of depressed, I'm feeling kind of bummed.
I also think that the motivations in doing this aren't necessarily like those of certain media outlets, just trying to solve his suicide. I think it's a conscious effort, very much in the spirit of Bourdain, to alter our deeply held perceptions of who he was and be unflinchingly honest in how we now view him. However, it's important to note that Roadrunner isn't the only posthumous project that tried to do that. Several oral histories have since been released by two of Bourdain's closest collaborators, featuring an almost definitive collection of oral testimonies from those who knew him. But if you're looking for a clear idea of the real Bourdain, you're not going to find it here. Whilst these testimonies are full of the same love and admiration that we had for Tony whilst he was alive, they also reveal someone who was far from the coolest guy ever. Instead, they show someone who is selfish and erratic, and at times even abusive to those he worked with, on one occasion physically assaulting Vitali. If anything, reading these testimonies just makes an already complicated guy just seem that much more complicated. This is where a project like Roadrunner inevitably goes further, because whilst it does include a collection of talking head testimonies from those who knew Bourdain, it is also a film by Morgan Neville, who himself never met Bourdain but seeks to tell an authoritative story of his life. The question, of course, becomes, what kind of story do we tell of Anthony Bourdain now with the hindsight we have, specifically with the knowledge of how it ends? Well, I think in many ways it is a story with a Bourdain that is almost the exact opposite of everything we once thought he was, and that many of the things we used to find so alluring about him were actually some of his darker traits. People used to look at Bourdain and see a guy with the best job in the world, but for all the benefits that lifestyle brought him, there were equal downsides I don't think many people appreciated.
How much are you on the road?
About 250 days a year.
And it goes without saying that that lack of stability will inevitably have an impact on a person. It's plainly apparent in the Buenos Aires episode where Bourdain talks openly that he has a recurring dream where he's stuck in a hotel room that he can't get out of.
Are you alone?
I'm alone in this dream, yes.
And of course, I used to look at Anthony and think his lifestyle was just evidence of his vivacity for life and how he was dedicated to living every day to its fullest. But looking at it now, you can also see quite a destructive motivation behind why Anthony lived the way he did. Many that knew Bourdain have characterized him as having an extremely addictive personality left over from his drug years, that he was constantly searching for that new experience. And as much as that is a huge reason why he was so great at his job, I think it naturally must have created an environment where you are never totally satisfied or content. And this finally brings us to what many of us thought was the best thing about Bourdain, that he was this personification of authenticity and truly knowing oneself, when that too probably wasn't totally true. Many of his public appearances reveal that he was at heart an introvert. It is why he got into the chef business in the first place, was that it was an industry that accepted outsiders. And I think it's obvious that problems will naturally arise for that kind of person when they become one of the most famous people on the planet. And Anthony's success didn't just make him famous, it turned him into a brand. It fundamentally changed his identity. He had a public image he now had to live up to, namely of the most interesting man in the world. I think being called that type of thing is as much a compliment as it is like a life sentence for imposter syndrome. And I think that immense pressure is ultimately what led him to push himself and his team so hard, is that I think he was scared of turning into what he hated, what he had made fun of so much on the show. Essentially a guy who'd bought into his own bullshit. And it was this struggle that leads us to an infamous incident that occurred whilst Anthony was shooting an episode of Parts Unknown in Sicily. While shooting a scene where Anthony was scuba diving, his local guides, along with certain producers of that episode, began to throw dead octopuses in the water to create the illusion that Anthony was interacting with the local sea life. And this didn't just make Bourdain angry, it caused him to go into what looks like a full-blown depressive spiral on camera. Later admitting in the episode he'd left the shoot and got so drunk he couldn't remember filming certain scenes. In a later interview, Anthony clarified what exactly happened here, and what he says is almost impossible to ignore.
And the implication, explicit or not, from some of the people I was working with on that episode in particular, that I should play along with this horrendous manipulation of reality, when in fact I wanted to murder everybody involved and then hang myself in the shower. It was a dark place, dark, very dark, low moment.
Watching this clip back now is, of course, heartbreaking and hard to watch. But at the same time, it is also weirdly like the exact kind of thing we've been looking for this whole time. I think a huge part of the trauma of Bourdain's death was that it felt like something we couldn't even begin to understand. But him talking about it so openly here gives us a small but important insight into what he was going through. Whilst all of this is tough to learn, perhaps it's the kind of thing that we've needed to hear this whole time. That the Bourdain that we once thought we knew wasn't really him. Whilst it inspired us and enriched our lives, it inherently neglected the darker parts of his character. I don't think I wanted to think of Bourdain as someone who was deeply flawed and consistently failed to be happy or a good person. I loved the idea of him as an aspirational character. He was everything I found exciting and inspiring about life. But the fact is, no one could have ever been the person I think a lot of us thought Bourdain was. He wasn't the most interesting man in the world. He was just another person like you or I, just as unstable and insecure and messy. And that is the best way we can honour him. That we don't remember him as Anthony Bourdain, but as a real human being. However, whilst I think we could justifiably tell ourselves that, I think we need to really think twice before we do. Because if people leave this video or a film like Roadrunner thinking that they have a greater understanding of what Bourdain struggled with, and therefore that they can start to make sense of his death even a little bit, I think we're in danger of taking the exact opposite from this that we should. Because whilst we like to think a tribute to Bourdain focuses more on his life, it is almost inextricably connected to how he died. It is almost the primary motivation for doing it in the first place, is to tell a story of his life that makes a bit more sense in light of his suicide. And so to do that, we put more weight and we investigate his insecurities, his struggles with fame, his addictive personality. But I think in doing that, we often leave out the most important detail, which is that none of them should really matter. Helen Rosner, in her profile of Roadrunner, said crafting the story, or any story of Bourdain's death, raises its own ethical questions. And I think that is because Bourdain is clearly someone who suffered from mental illness, both bouts of depression and suicidal thoughts. And whilst he did have many personal struggles in his life which will have aggravated that, I don't think they should form any part of any narrative that includes his death, when what killed him is something that is specifically void of narrative. I think it's in danger of causing people to look at Bourdain as this uniquely complex guy with these unknowable personal struggles and demons, when what killed him is tragically common and frankly boring. The suicide of Anthony Bourdain is no more special or unique because he was Anthony Bourdain, and I think stories like this can sometimes run counter to that idea. Bourdain himself kind of explained it the best in Buenos Aires, when he talks about how getting a bad burger in an airport can send him into a spiral.
Suddenly, I look at the hamburger and I find myself in a spiral of depression that can last for days.
So whilst we think that these struggles he suffered throughout his life are all important and demand investigation, in the end they're all about as important as that burger. What started all of this is that we were uncomfortable with Bourdain's death. We couldn't accept a life that loomed so large, that seemed to have so much meaning to it, to just end in such a meaningless way. But I think if we really want to honour Bourdain, we have to at one point accept the inherently meaningless nature of what happened to him, and that it is something that we will never begin to understand, no matter how much we find out about the real him. And I know what you're thinking right now. Ewan, did I just watch a 20-minute video for you to tell me that it's all pointless and a man died for nothing? Well, I know it does seem like a pretty hopeless conclusion that we've come to with Bourdain. That in our efforts to better understand him, we've only realised how unknowable he really is, and by trying to make some sense of his suicide, we've only realised how inherently meaningless it is. However, that doesn't solve our problem, which is how are we supposed to reconcile all that with the fact that he did mean something to us, and he still does. I think for a lot of this, we've been trying to understand Bourdain from his perspective, trying to get to the truth of who he was and what he was going through. And the inevitable problem with that is that we will never know that for sure, because the one person who could do that is gone now. But something that we can do, and something that we will know for sure, is what he means and represents to us individually. In a way, it's almost got nothing to do with Bourdain himself. It's the scary and beautiful thing about legacy, is that you don't really have control over it. I think he's just lucky that as legacies go, Anthony's got a pretty good one. Anthony changed a lot of things for the better whilst he was alive, whether it was putting you onto a certain type of street food or fundamentally broadening the scope of your empathy to another group of human beings. His dedication to his craft and what he proved with his life's work didn't just make food TV respected or mainstream, it made it a genre where diversity and experimentation is championed. And he didn't just make some cool food shows, he made vital records of time and place. He uplifted voices that long deserved it. He broke deeply moulded stereotypes. All in all, he was a pretty good dude, I reckon. So with all that being said, the question of course becomes, what does Anthony Bourdain mean to me? And it's hard to say, because I honestly think of something that Bourdain said like every couple of days. His narration kind of takes over my inner dialogue like Mark Corrigan sometimes. But one that has stuck with me the most is something he said when he was talking about taking up jiu-jitsu and about learning a skill in general.
For me, it's like showing up every day and sucking a little less at something. That's enormously satisfying to me.
And it's this little offhand sentiment of self-deprecating optimism that is representative of what Anthony Bourdain means to me. And funnily enough, it ties into the broader theme of this video. Oh, wow. But when I think of Anthony Bourdain now, I think of ignorance. I know that sounds weird. I mean, Anthony had more right than most people to think of himself as generally being quite wise about the world. But somehow he always seemed to have this attitude that he knew little more than the average person about how the world works.
And as wrong as I've been, I'm always the stupidest person in the room wherever I go.
I don't think this was just modesty, but his genuine outlook on life. It's why when he was often asked by journalists to impart the revelations he's had from his storied and travelled life, they were always pretty simple.
A lot of gray areas in travel. But I think that on balance, the world is filled with people doing the best they can, you know?
It's like the more Bourdain learnt about the world, the more experiences he had and people he met, the more he just became certain about how much he didn't know. And I think it's because Bourdain knew better than most people that it doesn't matter how far you travel or how much you do, life will continue to humble you, that there are parts of the world that are too complex and messy to ever fully figure out. I think his shows are about that balance between our desperate need to understand the human experience with the knowledge that we never can, our want to paint the world as a place full of meaning and romance with the reality that there is none. Basically, I think as much as Anthony Bourdain helped us make sense of the world, I think he also sought to remind us that we're not supposed to. Because I think he knew that if you embrace that ignorance, if you accept that there are some things that you will never fully understand, then you actually open yourself up to listen and change. Not in hopes of one day making sense of it all, just sucking a bit less at it every day.
You know, you're starting out as a writer, you've written one book, and you got a TV show, and somebody offers you $1 million to, represent an anti-diarrhea medication. Well, that's a lot of money in the short run, but you're always going to be that guy with the shits. That's a life sentence. Hey, it's diarrhea guy.